Good morning, folks. It's Branov and myself again, talking about the post-independence history or happenings in the Republic of Macedonia. And we're going to go back to Arachinovo because Arachinovo was a defining moment for many reasons. First, it made a lie of the Euro-Atlantic values that violence does not work. In fact, it was the violence of Arachinovo that, in my opinion, cemented the occupation of Macedonia by foreign forces and the change in direction of our country's identity. Would you agree with that, Marco?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it started even earlier in 1999, as we mentioned in a previous video. The message was that violence was the way that they were going to get their way. And in 2001, there were a number of military skirmishes, but the one at Arachinovo was particularly memorable because of the way that it ended, where the president of Macedonia at the time, Boris Trajkovski, essentially allowed the Uchuka to escape this town when there was no military reason to. There was simply a political reason to. If you ask certain people, they'll say that he was being threatened with aerial bombing if he didn't do it. I don't know that we'll ever find out if that's true, but that's certainly a common belief. One of the reasons we won't find out about it is the fact that he died under suspicious circumstances later on in a plane crash, which also has certainly a feeling of suspicion around it. So Arachinovo was a turning point. It was a moment where the Macedonian government essentially didn't fulfill its most basic requirement, which is the basic requirement of every country, which is to defend its borders. And once you go down that path, it's tough to come back. It led to a number of things that we touched on before. After 2001, you had the Ohrid Framework Agreement, you had the amnesty law. Several years later, you had the election of Nikola Gruevski in 2006, and everything continued on from that moment. I mean, how did Nikola Gruevski get into power? Well, one of the ways that he got into power was by making a coalition with the political party DUI, which is essentially the same ONA Uchuka terrorist group, except they have replaced their war fatigues with fine suits and have essentially been given ministries. That this is what we were talking about last time about the various aspects of the Gruevski legacy, and certainly one of the aspects of the Gruevski legacy and other governments has been the normalization of the Uchuka, bringing it from being an official terrorist group to being considered politicians.
Well, was that the first time that there'd been a coalition with Albanian parties?
There has been a coalition with Albanian parties in every single Macedonian government.
Including the first one.
Yeah, I believe that every single one of them had it. It was sort of like a unwritten rule that an Albanian minority party would be part of the government. But it was a little bit different in the earlier days of the Republic because that was before the war. Afterwards, they weren't just allowing an Albanian party. That wasn't the issue at all. It was essentially a terrorist party. It was a party that had killed people, and even today, when you take a look at an Artan Grubi or any of these characters from the DUI, usually you'll see them speaking to the cameras, and behind them there will be an American flag or a European Union flag, and those flags are used for, or of course with an Albanian flag as well, and those flags are used essentially like gang signs. It's an attempt to show, like, look who stands behind us, and it's all
Yeah.
about intimidation.
And it's true, though, isn't it? You would say that the Albanians have been used as shock troops to keep, I guess, to keep us in line, to keep us in place.
Yeah, I mean, you could
That's
go.
that's how I see it. Not just in Macedonia, also in Kosovo. It was used to, I guess, wrest Kosovo away from the Serbs.
That's right. That's right. And even if you go back into further back into history, there has been that kind of element of Albanians being involved in the control of the area on behalf of the Turks. If you go back that
Yeah,
far. But
exactly.
in the modern era, post the Berlin Wall falling, the Albanians have become a useful political force for the United States and the European Union to exploit. 1999 was the big opportunity which they took, and like I was saying before, 2001 was a matter of they already have an army, they might as well use it, and that's exactly what they did. In 2006, when Nikola Gruevski comes onto the scene, he does so with the UÇK hand in hand. And if you think back about legacy, again, a complicated legacy there. But certainly one of the negative aspects of the legacy was the way that the UÇK was normalized. Very famously, later on in the Gruevski era, we have the incident of Talat Jaferi, also known as Commandant Forina, who was a UÇK terrorist and had been a politician for several years, being elevated to become the Minister of Defense. So that happened under Gruevski's watch, and I think that was the final blow for a lot of people who had already been unhappy about things like the cancellation of the census.
Speaking about censuses quickly, when was our last census in Macedonia?
The last census that occurred in Macedonia was 2002, a rather questionable one, which we touched on earlier. But the Constitution requires that a census be taken every 10 years. So in 2012, in the lead up to the census, the parties essentially could not come to an agreement about how to proceed, and they essentially canceled it, totally in contradiction to the Constitution. That's one thing I've heard mentioned before is, it's one thing to be a constitutional scholar and to have an advanced degree in law in terms of understanding fine points within the Constitution, but even a layman knows how to count. Knows the difference between 10 and 19. So the census being canceled is another example of what I would say a fundamental responsibility of any country would be to fulfill its obligations under the Constitution and to count the number of citizens that it has. The reason that it was canceled obviously is very much connected to the Ohrid Framework Agreement, because within the Ohrid Framework Agreement, any region that has 20% of a particular ethnic minority or more gets a wealth of new privileges, including use of their language as an official language and other privileges, including quotas. Yeah, quotas for the police and quotas in the judiciary. So it involved a lot of money and a lot of power, a lot of political power, and anyone who could not get the census numbers that they wanted would be in trouble. So now there are, nobody really knows how many people are in Macedonia, and how many of which ethnicity are in Macedonia, how many left, how many were born, how many died. Like, I think there's a certain amount of data that people are getting from hospital records and things like that But without a proper census, I mean, you can't run a legitimate election.
So when Nikola comes in, he comes in as a pro-Western conservative, and he's faded by the West. And the SDSM party at that time were considered pro Serbian, anti-Western. A lot has changed since then. I guess now they're both in the same camp. Both VMRO and SDSM are in fact on the same page for virtually most of the important issues. Am I right there? Are we giving Diplomanea a pass just because of their name?
Well, I mean, I think that both parties are officially Euro-Atlantic, you know, in terms of even going back to the beginnings of the Republic. But the difference, one of the big differences, is that the SDSM is the party which you know, came out of the old Yugoslavia. So just in terms of marketing, in terms of messaging, in terms of the types of things that their politicians were saying, there was a tradition of being skeptical of the West and skeptical of NATO that goes back way before Macedonia was independent. So so I think that SDSM was on a trajectory to, you know, warm up to the idea of having a Western hegemon and adjusting their rhetoric accordingly. The big change happens in 2001, where I think everything changes. It's a major turning point in the history of the country. But yeah, certainly nowadays, if you were to you know, ask people about SDSM's relationship to the West, it would be one of absolute subservience. You know, you could certainly make the argument that that wasn't the case back in the lead up to 2001, when the SDSM-led government was purchasing Ukrainian helicopters against the wishes of Washington in order to fight a war against an enemy that was in a very very close relationship with NATO. So you know, the 2001 experience changed all of that. All of a sudden, instead of the Ucheka running around in the mountains, they were running around in the Sobranie, and so that changed everything. It certainly increased over time, even during the period of Nikola Gruevski, which is touted in, you know, mainstream media, Western newspapers, as being a right-wing or nationalist party. You know, actually, you know, it's quite shocking to think that that someone like Talat Jaferi, who used to be called Commandant Forina, would become the Minister of Defense in that government.
That is supposed to be ultra-nationalist.
Yeah, I mean, that's fairly acquiescent.
So, Marco, in your opinion, when did Gruevski's star start waning in terms of his relationship with the West, and what were the Sharana Revolucija all about? If that was certainly an attempt to discredit, I guess, Gruevski and destroy the power of the VMRO. So why do you think? May I ask, why do you think Gruevski fell out of favor with the West?
I mean, it's hard to say. I can only talk about what was obvious, like what was in the public square at the time. I think that there was a view that that, you know, there was room for negotiation on things like the name. Obviously, you have an ongoing name negotiation through Matthew Nimitz that continued throughout the era, including you know, after 2008. You know, when the NATO closed the door on Macedonia. So it was never really a matter of Gruevski saying no in a categorical way to those important national issues, but it certainly is perceived that he was being more resistant. You know, In 2004, the United States famously recognized the Republic of Macedonia under its name. Canada did in 2007, I believe, and a number of other countries followed suit that had been holdouts. At a certain point in the Gruevski era, 136 countries, I believe, had recognized the Republic of Macedonia. So that's many more than, for example, Kosovo has today. The forward progression looked like if they were going to come to some sort of name agreement, that Gruevski would be the one who would put it to a referendum that was binding, and would respect the outcome of that referendum. So it wasn't that he was saying no, but probably he wasn't saying yes either. And to the extent that he wasn't saying yes, that may have been part of the reason why the West obviously wanted him gone. That becomes very apparent in 2015 when we have the so-called bombi. So the bombi are recorded phone calls essentially of all kinds of high-level officials only in the Vlmiro Diplomatie party, which is quite odd because obviously whoever was making those recordings was making them of all of the parties. It's widely considered that the former Secret Service was involved in it, and there's a bunch of question marks about how these recordings came to be. But one way or another, the recordings were released on YouTube in such a way that created a revolt, and was then quickly exploited. The exploitation of those angry feelings would eventually be turned into what was called the Šarena Revolucija, or the colorful revolution, where you see the fingerprints of international NGOs with foreign backing and foreign funding essentially converging on Macedonia in order to remove Gruevski's government. And so people who joined it for different reasons. Certainly some were fed up with corruption, other issues, but a lot of it was also political exploitation of the worst kind by non-Macedonian actors who were involved in finding a government that was more conducive to their interests.
So, in my opinion, the Šarena Revolucija was America stamping its authority and more or less saying we will support whoever we want, and whoever is able to meet our needs the most will be the rulers of Macedonia. And that's what I think happened, because corruption was rife, not just amongst the Diplomatie, but I mean, isn't Crvenkovski considered the godfather of corruption in Macedonia?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, also I think that the Šarena Revolucija was to stamp out any say pro-socialist or pro-Eastern, pro-non-Western forces by embracing them rather than by destroying them.
Yeah, if we could just briefly compare it to the Ukraine. I mean, you probably I presume you would agree that there are a lot of parallels there. In 2014, the Ukraine was taken down the Ukrainian government was taken down in a very similar manner. The big difference being that a lot more people were killed. Other than the deaths, the death count, the methodology of the Šarena Revolucija and what happened in Ukraine was very, very similar. That was also connected to Russia and connected to Russia's influence and the Pentagon's need to push that influence back. So certainly this was sort of an experiment that had already been tried in other parts of the world. You could even argue in Egypt as well. If there are a number of incidents where you see this tactic of using NGOs to pose as neutral third parties on the ground, or to make a movement look organic from the people, bottom up, grassroots, whatever you want to call it, and then you find out later that it's not really like that, is it?
And to distract from the fact that it's coming from a nation, by allowing people to vilify an individual like Soros and anyone else who might be there. Whereas in fact Soros is virtually doing the work of the State Department, the work that they were doing directly once upon a time. Mark, so then we get to the election, and we have really the VivaMacedonia, I guess, were still a major party, the biggest party, but were unable to make a government because they wouldn't agree with the demands of the Albanian bloc. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, are we talking about 2015 still?
Yeah, talking about Zaev's election.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it'd be good to take a step back. In 2015, you have the Snimki, which come out, which create the the street protests and the throwing of paint and all of these street tactics that were making news all over the world. This would lead to what they called the Pržino Agreement, where Gruevski agreed to step down, essentially. Right. So that was the first step, and in the midst of stepping down, there was a period of time where he would eventually be accused of a crime involving the acquiring of a Mercedes-Benz, which was purchased at a price that was higher than it should have been, and the idea was that he was involved in corruption with regards to that case. There was a long period of time that was taking place, where President Ivanov was still the president, and could have still used amnesty powers, and so basically nothing was happening for the longest time. Then a little bit later on, Gruevski would exit stage left in a dramatic way, where he would be under a quote-unquote house arrest. I don't know what kind of house arrest that was, when there's a police officer watching the front door, but there's nobody watching the back door. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what the story was, but it was something kind of hilarious, and it involved taking a midnight ride over borders to end up in Hungary, where Gruevski's old friend Viktor Orban was waiting with open arms and would eventually give him asylum as a political prisoner. So as a result, Gruevski is now living in Budapest, and he's out of the political picture officially, except for the odd Facebook status. And then, meanwhile, the governing of Macedonia was put in the hands of Zoran Zaev.
And at the same time, Gruevski's right-hand man and closest ally remained in Macedonia and kept his wealth and got out of jail, and helped actually Zaev form his government. Would you say that with Mialkov?
Oh, Sasha Mialkov, that's his cousin. Yeah. So aside from being his relative, he was also the head of, he was the head of, or involved with the Secret Service in Macedonia, and was considered a kind of kingmaker for many years. Certainly implicated in a number of the recordings as well. and would later play a role in the things that Zoran Zaev is particularly infamous for. If we look at the agenda of the Zaev government, it involved coming to power in an election where they actually lost. We should remember that, despite the fact that there's question marks surrounding all of these post-2012 elections because of the census issue. You also have the reality, which is that the VivaMacedonia actually got more votes and got more seats. But instead of keeping the tradition, which was that the Macedonian party that had the largest number of seats and the Albanian party that had the largest number of seats would make a coalition, they decided to forego that tradition, and the Sidasama and the Dui made a coalition government and put the VivaMacedonia in opposition. Then we started to see what Zoran Zaev's real agenda was, and certainly it is seen by Macedonians, certainly in the diaspora, especially as catastrophic in terms of the amount of damage that's been done to Macedonia's national interests. So I guess we could say that there are a number of ways in which this came about, but maybe I should talk a little bit about some of the incidents that led up to it. I had mentioned earlier that Talat Jaferi, a fairly nefarious character in Macedonian history, as a member of the UÇK, had previously been the Minister of Defense, so he had been the minister in charge of the army that he was previously alleged to have been shooting at. Afterwards, there was a very dubious attempt to install him, or almost coronate him, as the Speaker of the Parliament, which culminated in a famous violent incident where there was a large number of protesters that showed up in the Macedonian Parliament because of the way that Talat Jaferi was illegally being pushed into a position without enough votes. This led to fisticuffs. There were some injuries, and then later on, the people who were arrested were given extremely serious, prison sentences involving terrorism charges. So that kind of set the stage. That was called the April 27th incident, 2017. After that incident, it was just another proof that the country was simply not operating under rule of law. When you had Talat Jaferi, an official, representative of a terrorist army, being coronated as the Speaker of the Parliament, and then the people who were essentially intervening during this coronation, they were being charged as terrorists. Exactly the opposite of what you'd expect. So that was a moment which would set up what would happen next. Once that Jaferi was in charge, a number of other things would fall into place in terms of Zaev's agenda. First and foremost being the Prespa Agreement. So the Prespa Agreement is essentially an agreement between the Republic of Macedonia and Greece, where the Republic of Macedonia was agreeing
to all the demands.
Yeah, it was agreeing to basically everything that Greece had asked for. The change of their name, some extremely heinous articles like describing the history of Aegean Macedonia, which is particularly offensive to all Macedonians, particularly those who are from Aegean Macedonia, and a number of other extremely anti-democratic measures. So this agreement was extremely unpopular There was a referendum that was held in order to give it a stamp of approval. That referendum was boycotted and it failed. It was a non-binding referendum, however. This would lead to a number of other pantomimes in the Sobranie, which would eventually culminate in having 8 members of the opposition coalition change their vote. Some of them under extremely dubious circumstances. Like, for example, there were a number of members of the opposition party that were being charged with very serious crimes, and then they were let out of prison in order to vote for the government in a particular way, and then all of a sudden their charges went away.
And Mielkov plays a role in this. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, just a ridiculous series of events and a complete perversion of justice.
Mielkov plays a crucial role in that also. With we heard that he was involved in convincing the people that they should vote. Is that correct?
So they say. I think that it has to do with what's reported and what we believe, but essentially Sasha Mielkov was certainly one of the members of the former VivaMacedonia government that was charged, and then after all of those events, suddenly the charges were lessened and reduced. There was a it's just very interesting how Gruevski ends up in Hungary and Mielkov ends up walking the streets in Skopje, attending his hotel in the middle of the city, and other real estate that he owns. Certainly giving the impression, I would say, that doesn't matter.
Which you got through.
Who's,
yeah.
Sorry.
And Mielkov's wealth was obviously based on winning the lottery. And
yeah.
Working very hard.
Yeah, he was a great saver. He was a very aggressive saver.
Yeah.
So the corruption of that era was very much associated with him in the public mind, and so as a result, there were a number of protests and other things that took place, but the name change is a huge issue for Macedonian people. It's certainly not in the past the way that it's portrayed. It's certainly not viewed as a great leap forward by the vast majority of Macedonians, in my opinion. It's very difficult to get polling, but I think that the disgust over that agreement is particularly acute. It's not the only agreement that Zaev has involved himself in. There have been others. One would be the equally infamous, maybe, agreement with Bulgaria, the so-called Good Neighborly Agreement, the ironically named Good Neighborly Agreement, that involves a capitulation of a different kind. Here you have the Bulgarian government being a part of a committee that is reviewing all of Macedonia's textbooks and its official view of its history, and claiming significant portions of it for themselves. So that's a serious threat. The Tirana platform is another aspect of this, where Zaev has completely made a departure from what the Ohrid Framework Agreement was supposed to promise, and has pushed Albanian as an official language in almost like a binational model, where the Republic of Macedonia ceases to become a nation state of the Macedonian people. So there are so many. I don't want to get bogged down into details, but there are so many of these initiatives that are widely traitorous, and they're one after another. It's in rapid fire to the point where Macedonian people have themselves, I think, started to lose track of how many there were. I think that, you know, one incident that I think is symbolic or sums it up was Ilinden, the national holiday in Macedonia, the 2nd of August, a very important day, which is usually you know, attended to by a ceremony in Kruševo, where the Kruševska Republika was proclaimed. And here you had two events in 2017, which I think summed up the type of transformation that has taken place in the Republic of Macedonia. So, first of all, in Kruševo, you had a ceremony which involved Zaev and Bojko Borisov to celebrate so-called Bulgarian Ilinden, and then you had a ceremony where the MC is Tale Jaferi speaking in Albanian, right? Then you have, at the same time, a U.S. Army show of force in Skopje, where they have tanks and other forms of military equipment in the Ploštat in Skopje at exactly the same time at the same day. So sending a strong message of pacification, you could say. And so I think that really kind of sets the tone for everything that happened. Massive, you know, a massive series of violations of every aspect of rule of law, every aspect of international standards of democracy, and essentially taking what has the vestiges of an independent country and making it essentially an occupied country or an occupied territory.
I guess you know, the difference in sentencing of the murder of that young Macedonian boy who gets 3 years, and the pulling of someone 4 years, that encapsulates, in my opinion, everything that's wrong with our legal and our political system, because it's definitely right that our legal system is determined by our political and our politically corrupt system. So how can we have a non-corrupt system when it's controlled by a politically corrupt system? So, Marco, where do we go from here, man? What can we do? You know, we in the diaspora, what can we do, and the people in the Republic, what can they do to change this situation, to reclaim their identity and reclaim their pride?
I don't think there are any easy answers. I think that a lot of people will respond with this phrase "chare?" ? Right, which essentially means, you know, what is to be done, right?
Yeah.
I think that the insistence of "chare" is so you know, it leads to such pessimism because there isn't a very clear path. Certainly, you know, in the midst of the COVID measures that have been taking place, most recently, the Zaev government has had fallen based on its own, you know, bombi, and a video which was released, which showed people close to Zaev accepting, you know, very large amounts of money in bribery, and that is what led them to call early elections, set up a so-called technička vlada in preparation for the election. Then the COVID crisis hits, and you know, the Macedonian government has been very much criticized for the way that it has handled that, and now in the midst of the numbers apparently going up in a daily way, they've decided to cancel the COVID crisis, so that's no longer a crisis. It has no bearing on how many people are dying. It's just like the same number of people, more or less, that were threatened before, except they've decided to have an election on the 15th of July in about a month's time. So, in terms of what to do, there's a lot of people who are going to go back to VivaMacedonia in order to get Zaev out of office and get the SDS out of office. There are others who are not going to be doing that. Either they'll be voting for a minor party, or they'll not be voting at all. I'm not really sure that anything is clear, except that voting for Zaev would be suicidal for the Macedonia's future as a country. I think that the Republic of Macedonia, in order for it to be revived, in order for its name to be brought back, would require a number of steps which are not at all clear. It wouldn't necessarily happen anytime soon, but it has to start with one step. And some people feel that the most important step is to make sure that the Zaev government is voted out, and for that reason are going to support the VivaMacedonia, and others just simply won't because of all of the things that have happened. I don't know what to tell you, Jiv. I think that everyone should approach the issue according to their own conscience and what they're willing to do. I would respect anyone who who resists the current government in what it's doing to Macedonia's national interests, and I recognize that there are going to be differences of opinion about how to resist those interests. I mean, those threats to those interests. So we'll see very soon.
Marco, two more things or three more things that are first, the Russian influence in Macedonia. I mean, what next? What proof? I mean, what proof is there for any Russian influence in Macedonia, other than whatever's coming out of whatever of the real news that comes out of American intelligence? So
I don't know how much proof there is of Russia's involvement in the United States either. You know, I think that there was a huge brouhaha over that. There were congressional hearings and investigations into everything from the purchase of a relatively small amount of Facebook ads to stuff involving Trump and Biden's son, and it's not worth getting into the details, but it just seems like that was a total nothing burger in America. When the same attitude is applied to the Macedonian situation, it becomes farcical. I mean, the Euro-Atlantic influence in Macedonia is total. The Euro-Atlantic influence is on every single institution, every party, everything that happens with, more or less some form of Euro-Atlantic approval. So, there's the idea that the Russians are somehow particularly involved is an evidence-free conspiracy theory.
It's a nudge, it's a wink. Yeah, Russians.
It's a code, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's a code. I think if you are looking to ingratiate yourself with certain people, in the U.S. State Department, then you talk about the Russian influence on Macedonia, that's one way to, I guess, get into their good books, because you're just sort of knowing what side you're on, maybe.
Yeah.
In terms of, I think it's a code. In terms of actual evidence, I certainly am not aware of any, and the idea that that Macedonia hasn't been inundated with Western influence is just insupportable. I mean, even people who are 100% pro-NATO, 100% pro-EU, I think they would all agree that the influence of Euro-Atlantis on Macedonia is extremely intense. And that was another thing that we might as well mention is during the COVID crisis, using the name that was that was imposed by the Prespa Agreement, the country did actually officially join NATO, right? Which is something that even going back to the earliest days of the Republic, something that the politicians in all the parties was talking about, but it wasn't. The idea was never to enter in this shambles. A shambles in terms of the identity being threatened, the history being written, the terrorist army, Utrika members, becoming political players and then essentially becoming the kingmakers who run the country. This kind of entry into NATO was not on anyone's agenda, and the European Union is something that could never happen. We'll see, but I don't know. I don't know what that changes either. In terms of NATO, what is NATO's role? Its role is to get a bunch of countries together who are agreeing to protect each other in case they are attacked, right? So, historically, the attack would have come from Russia, right? Certainly, and I think that's still the way that the organization is aimed. But essentially, there's a component of mutual defense, and there's a component of buying large amounts of U.S.-made weapons, right? And I think that with the change of status of almost member to member, I really don't know what has changed except that the bill has gotten a lot bigger. Already, the country had already been purchasing Western weapons for decades. There's no change in that except now they're going to be pressured to purchase much more of it, and the costs associated with that is going to have to be borne. If there is a NATO conflict in the future, then Macedonian soldiers would be sent there in order to die. In terms of protection, which is what NATO is about, protection from whom? I think the only people who would attack the country would be NATO countries themselves. So it's so absurd. It's become such a farce. There was a time when I looked at NATO membership myself in a much more favorable light, not because I ever thought that NATO was a particularly I never thought of NATO as a band of Boy Scouts, but I think that the idea was that Macedonia could protect itself in its own way, by joining this alliance the same way that, say, Canada has joined that alliance. Canada defends its borders the same way. So there was a time in history where I think it made a lot more sense. Now, I don't know how much sense it makes. The EU, it's the same thing. The EU has its fingers in every pie in Macedonia already. There's a huge amount of influence, political, economic, and otherwise. I think what would change is that instead of Macedonian citizens, getting Bulgarian citizenship in order to go to Germany to wash dishes, they would be able, in theory, with the EU passport, to go directly, to Germany to wash dishes.
I
don't know what else changes.
That's really, they've been holding up that carrot for a long time, and they've been whacking us with the same stick for a long time. In my opinion, NATO was never justified. It was based on the assumption that the Soviet Union would somehow roll through and take over Western Europe, which there was no chance of the Soviet Union ever doing that. But that's another story. But I think, Marco, in my opinion, joining NATO is putting your signature on the contract that you are now legally occupied. Before that, you were de facto occupied. Now, well, we're now all buddies, so now you're legally occupied. Because it's not just Macedonia that's de facto and legally occupied. You could argue that all the NATO countries answer to the USA one way or the other, and it takes a very strong NATO country not to do what the USA wants. I haven't seen that happen yet. Has there been an example of a NATO country not doing what America wants? I don't know.
I think there are, but it's just, you know, it's such an apples and oranges situation. You know, I know that there's certainly plenty of support in Canada for Canada's NATO membership, but Canada's situation is so different in so many ways in terms of its economic situation, the nature of the country and the territory that it has to defend, and its very, very close relationship to the United States, which is historical. I think when it comes to the Republic of Macedonia and the incredible sacrifices that it's had to make in order to get this membership, I don't know that membership and the other kind of membership is the same kind of membership, if you know what I mean. You know,
No. Between our nation, yes. Canada, Australia, and England, they were fraternal nations, you could say. The rest of Europe wasn't fraternal. Germany was definitely occupied and still is. But Macedonia, we are not fraternal. We are a subject. We are totally dominated by them. We have very little say. We don't have, in fact, in my opinion, we have no say, and that's borne out by the fact that we have Zaev instead of Gruevski, or instead of Vimmer, because, as you said, you know, the tradition was that the biggest party and the biggest Albanian party formed government. Well, that tradition was thrown overboard because I guess they thought they had a better sucker in Zaev, you know, and they could control him better.
Yeah, and also if we take a look at some of the other situations that NATO has been involved in, there's a much clearer set of rules of when NATO interacts with a non-NATO country. There are no rules for what happens when there's hostility between two NATO countries, as there is often between Greece and Turkey. And you know, recently there was actually an incident where apparently some piece of territory was annexed, a relatively small piece of territory was annexed by the Turkish government, you know, NATO doesn't have any mechanism for that because it's contrary to its basic rules. You know, every NATO country that is attacked promises to protect the country that's attacked. So if two significant NATO countries attack each other, or one attacks the other, that is the end of NATO, or at least the end of that country's membership. So in Macedonia's case, NATO countries surround it, you know, on practically every side, the exception being Serbia, which is not seen as any kind of threat.
And it's those three NATO countries who have profited most from what's happened with Zaev. It is at the behest of Greece, Bulgaria, and Albania, all NATO countries, that we have had to change our identity. We have to rewrite our history. We have to deny our history. So what did we get by getting into NATO? I don't know. What's the positives? I can't see any positives.
You get to pay a huge bill. You get to follow all of these foreign instructions, and you get to kiss away your identity, and you get to lose your history, and you get to lose your nation state. I don't know. It's indefensible in my view, but I think that you know, what's interesting is, you know, even in those situations where there is a kind of a general agreement between two neighbors, like for example, if you talk to the average Macedonian and to the average Serb about Kosovo, I don't think that their opinions would be that different, right? But if you take a look at the way that the Macedonian government reacts to Kosovo. I mean, there was an incident where Zaev, I think, voted for Kosovo joining UNESCO, and they drove the Serbs crazy. So the only neighboring country that the Macedonian government would stand up to do is Serbia, because it's not part of the group yet. And the only reason it's not part of the group yet is because it hasn't settled its Kosovo question.
It's coming. It's coming. The settlement is coming, apparently.
They're making some waves. We'll see. It's been a long time. So that issue starts in 1999, as you know, and it's unresolved. So I don't know how it plays out, but it just shows why some folks will simply refuse to celebrate Independence Day, because they don't feel that this country is independent, and they don't feel that it's been independent for a long time. Certainly since 2001, its independence has been seriously damaged.
Yeah, questionable.
And I would say earlier even,
Yeah, I would say virtually from the very, even towards the end of Gligurov, we lost our independence when we changed our name and our flag. That's when we lost our independence.
1995.
Marco, in my opinion, brother, the very fact that we were surrounded by NATO powers, yet we were told, join NATO, otherwise you won't be safe. Now, what does that imply? That implies that NATO is an aggressor, that if you don't join, they will attack you, because there was no one else who was going to attack us.
Well, the thing is, it's not theoretical. In 2001, an army with very close relationship to NATO did attack the country. So it's what I think I've mentioned before, that I always find it just blows my mind, is when you hear talking heads from the EU or from the State Department talk about how the Ohrid Framework Agreement helped Macedonia to avoid a civil war. And they actually use the word avoid as if it didn't happen. Yeah. And if you don't pay attention, or if you're a young person, maybe you will believe that. But I experienced that firsthand. I remember what it was like. In 2001, those Ukrainian helicopters were flying over our house. So I know what happened then, and everyone who lived there knows what happened then. But then they come out and they talk about this war that was avoided. It wasn't avoided. It happened. A lot of dead bodies happened as well. And the result was that the country lost its sovereignty.
We were forced at the point of a gun, in my opinion, at the point of a gun to accept whatever it was that our good neighbors around us wanted, so that they would feel better about their colonization processes, and also about their terrorist acts, calling it a civil war. Why would you have a civil war in a nation that affords you every possible human right and civil and political right? What would be the point of a civil war? Unless, of course, you want to destroy that nation. In my opinion, that is the agenda of PRESPA, and that is America's agenda. And I can't see any way out of it at this point in time, because our politicians, in my opinion, were too easily duped, seduced, or threatened, which takes me back to say Ivanov,
or purchased.
Yeah. Tell me about Ivanov, man. How is he going to go down how's his role going to be reinterpreted in the future? Because he said some incredible, gave some good speeches, held out a little while, but at the end, do you think
there are some differing opinions? I think that there's no doubt that he did make some legendary speeches. He did say the right things at certain times that made people proud of him.
Yeah.
I think that there are different opinions about how it played out in the end. You know, people who are more critical of him see him as capitulating. Others say that he was only one man and he couldn't have done it on his own, and he wasn't getting any support. He was threatened. I don't know what. So people are going to believe what they want to believe, but you know, President Ivanov, whatever you think of him, you know, he was a president of the Republic of Macedonia, as opposed to the current president, who uses this other term, right? So, you know, certainly that's going to be part of his legacy as well.
He will go.
Yeah, I think so. I think the story is not over. I'm as pessimistic as the next person. I think that there's plenty to be pessimistic about. I think if I want to, you know, maybe give a little bit of hope or something a little bit non-pessimistic, I would just talk about Macedonia's history and talk about how many dark periods there are in Macedonia's history. You know, if you think about it objectively and you compare this era to previous eras, you know, there was a period of time between 1913 and 1944 where the word Macedonia doesn't appear on the map, right? For 31 years. You know, you know, it's been very, very hard to be a Macedonian, and you know, one could argue that it's been easier to be a Macedonian in this era than it was back then. I think that what has happened is there were some impressive gains, and then those gains have been lost. So there's a feeling of going back to square one, and you know, the Republic finding itself in a position, something like Aegean Macedonia or Pedian Macedonia, where they're no longer in charge of their own destiny. The dream of independent Macedonia is not going to go away. It didn't go away during the Turkish era. It didn't go away through all the other eras, and I don't think it's going to go away in the future. I think that Macedonian independence, sovereignty, freedom are things that are part of Macedonia's character, and I don't think that this war is over, but there have been certainly some battles lost.
Mark, ironically enough, it was going to Ege that inspired me. Because what you're saying is correct. Our history is one of commitment to ourselves and our identity. And if after, 70 years, more than 70 years, nearly 100 years of Greek oppression of the worst kind, you can go back to Ege and see young boys singing patriotic partisan songs. That's the thing that gave me hope and still gives me hope, that if our people in Ege are rising up again and reclaiming first their cultural identity in a cultural way, that's just the beginning. You can't be Macedonian culturally and not be Macedonian politically. You know, so that's how I saw it. When I went to Ovčarani, when I went to all the little villages and ran into people who said proudly in Greek, ironically enough, many could not speak it, but who would say proudly, "We are Macedonian." That's what gave me hope, because, you know, in 1970s, in 1990s, people were not saying that, you know.
That's right.
And what I heard was that a lot of the old people, all the old partisans who were fearful and who would not teach their children about what had happened for fear of their children betraying themselves, they have now apparently started coming out. I've heard from a friend there who said, until I was 15 years old, I did not know what a Macedonian was, and my grandfather calls me in one day and tells me the story. And after that, he says, everywhere I went, I realized there were Macedonians. That's what gives me hope.
Yep.
Ege gives me hope.
Ironically.
Ironically. And I just want to say we'll do this again next week. Hopefully we'll get someone that we can interview other than ourselves. If we don't, I'd be happy for you, say, to interview me on a little bit of history, Greek, the history of the Greeks, because a lot of people need to know who these modern Greeks are who have been pushing this destroy Macedonia agenda.
And also what's at stake for them.
What's at stake? That's what. Yeah, what is at stake at that? If ever there was a house of cards based on false premises, on fake identities, it's hell us. I want to thank Zoran Lozitsky, producer. We'll see you all again next week sometime, folks. And if we don't find someone from Macedonia, if we can't organize someone from Macedonia to interview, Mark, you can interview me, bro. In the meantime, everybody, I hope you found this interesting, all handful of you. Hopefully, this podcast series will grow and we'll get a lot more people listening and learning, because that's all it's, in my opinion, bro, the whole point of this is to educate our people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marco.
Yeah.
Thank you, Zara.
Take it easy.
Adios, amigos.